In late 1914, on the Eastern Front, the Russian forces approached the German border and prepared to invade German territory. They were met with a strong Central Powers counterattack, which stopped their advance. In January of 1915, both sides are more or less equally matched. The Germans need to defeat France on the Western Front to win the war, but it is difficult for them to do, as they also have to defend against Russia. The Russian army is well positioned on the Eastern Front to threaten Central Powers territory. In the north, they can invade German East Prussia from several directions. In the center, they can move into the heart of Germany. In the south, they can cross the Carpathian Mountains and invade the core areas of Austria-Hungary. The Central Powers would like to have a better defensive position. For this reason, the Central Powers want to push the Russian army back so that it could be kept farther away from their vital areas. In January of 1915, both sides have most of their forces on the central part of the front. The Central Powers would now attack from more lightly defended flanks to outflank the Russian force in an attempt to force them to retreat from the center. At the same time, Russia too wants to attack the Central Powers' positions on the flanks. During the winter, battles would be fought in East Prussia and in the Carpathian Mountains. Both Russia and Germany began deploying their forces to East Prussia, but Germany made better use of its superior railway system. As a result, it was able to transport its troops faster, and the German forces arrived in East Prussia in early February before the Russian forces. The Germans deployed their main force of around 130,000 men against the Russian army of 150,000 men in the eastern part of the region. The task of this German army was to break through the Russian lines in this area. Despite the Germans being numerically inferior, they made it up by superior organization, which gave them the advantage over the Russian forces. The Russian army here was isolated, and this gave Germany the chance to outflank it. The Germans grouped their forces on both sides of the Russian army. Then they outflanked the Russian forces and forced them to withdraw from German territory. The Germans then set out towards their second objective. Russia had a string of fortresses on river lines southeast of East Prussia. The Germans moved out to breach this line, but their main attack was held up near the fortress of Grodno. In the center, the German forces were stopped before the fortress of Osowets, and in the west, their troops got bogged down fighting the Russian forces arriving from the central part of the front. Soon, more and more Russian forces arrived in this region. This halted the German advance. By the beginning of March, Russia had the combat strength of 415,000 against around 275,000 Germans. The Germans realized that they cannot overcome such a strong force. They pulled back to the borders of East Prussia and went to the defensive in preparation of Russian attack. Russia now began its attempt to attack East Prussia. During March, it launched several attacks against the German positions, but the balance of power was near equal, and Russia was unable to make much progress. Then the spring thaw put an end to the operations, and both sides dug in on their positions for the summer. In these battles, Russia lost 440,000 men as dead, missing and wounded, and Germany lost 90,000. At the same time, fighting had been taking place on the southern part of the front, where Austro-Hungarian forces were preparing to launch their own offensive. Here, the front line went mostly along the Carpathian Mountains. Austria-Hungary wanted to lift the siege of its fortress of Przemysl, which had been surrounded by the Russian forces and was running low on food supplies. In addition, it wanted to launch a supporting attack in the eastern part of the front. The Austro-Hungarian railways allowed its troops to arrive first to the area. At that time, the eastern part of the front was held only by very light Russian forces. The Austro-Hungarians crossed the Carpathian Mountains. Eventually, Russian reinforcements arrived and stopped further advance of the Austro-Hungarian forces. The main fighting took place on the western part of the front. The forces of both sides were roughly equal. The Austro-Hungarians had 410,000 men against 370,000 Russians. The plan of Austria-Hungary was to break through the Russian defenses in the mountains and reach Przemysl, so that it could relieve the fortress garrison. At the same time, Russia attempted to cross the Carpathians via the shortest route. These operations might have gone totally differently for both sides if they had not been fought in mountains in winter conditions. Austria-Hungary attacked first, but could make only very small territorial gains in late January at the price of large casualties. They were very far from reaching Przemysl. Then Russia attacked, but also could not gain much territory at the expense of heavy losses in mountain fighting. Austria-Hungary restarted its offensive towards Przemysl, and until the middle of March, both sides attacked and counterattacked in this direction with minimal territorial changes. The Austro-Hungarians were unable to reach the fortress of Przemysl. The garrison of the fortress ran out of supplies and surrendered to Russia. Without the need to relieve the fortress, Austria-Hungary stopped attacking and went on the defensive. Their surrender of Przemysl freed up part of the Russian troops, and in late March and early April they undertook another offensive. But this too could not capture much ground. In April, the snow began to melt, and this put a temporary halt to military operations. During the winter battles in the Carpathians, the Central Powers lost 520,000 men dead, wounded and missing, and in addition 300,000 men to sickness. Russia lost 460,000 soldiers dead, wounded and missing. The exact number lost due to illness has not been established. April 1915. The Central Powers' attacks on the flanks to push the Russian forces back have not worked. In fact, Russia has made use of its advantageous position to make some progress in crossing the Carpathians, and it now threatens the core areas of Austria-Hungary. The Central Powers' position is more difficult than before, and they must deal with this situation. The Central Powers now decide to launch a strong offensive against Russia to defeat the Russian forces and improve their defensive position. Before we proceed with the offensive, let's take a brief look at the Russian defenses on the Eastern Front. Behind the Russian forces, who have dug in at the front line, there are several natural defensive lines. In the northern part of the front, there is a system of rivers, which Russia has strengthened by building several fortresses. In the west, there is the wide Vistula River, which is a formidable obstacle. Then the defensive line passes along the smaller Sun River and is strengthened by the fortress of Przemysl. Then it passes into the Carpathian Mountains. Deep behind the front line are the Pripyat marshes, which is a great obstacle for military operations. The Central Powers' offensive began in the middle of April. Before it started, the Germans launched a diversionary attack on the northernmost part of the front, where German cavalry units moved into lightly defended Russian territory and diverted some of the Russian forces. The main offensive would be launched on the southern part of the front. For the offensive, the Germans have deployed some of their forces from the western front. These forces arrived west of the fortress of Przemysl, and their goal is to advance east and cut off the supply route for the Russian units in the Carpathian Mountains. Russia has a numerical advantage of 820,000 soldiers in this part of the front against 715,000 Central Powers troops, but most of the Russian forces are deployed to the south and are preparing for another offensive in the Carpathians. This allowed the Central Powers to achieve numerical superiority on Russia's western flank, where they deployed 320,000 Central Powers soldiers against 250,000 Russian soldiers. Roughly half of these forces were German, which gave the Central Powers some advantage in force quality. The offensive began in the middle of April. The Central Powers broke through the Russian defenses. During the battle, both sides suffered casualties, and in the end of it, Russia had 140,000 men left against the Central Powers' 200,000. Russia had lost its defensive positions on the front line, and the Central Powers still held the numerical advantage. This meant that the odds were against Russia. Russia retreated its forces back to the Sun River line and the fortress of Przemysl. It also pulled back its forces from the Carpathians. After this regrouping, The numbers on the critical part of the front were equal, with both sides having 340,000 men, and the Russians could now make use of the natural defenses of the Sun River and the fortress of Przemysl. This greatly strengthened their position. Russia felt so confident that in the eastern part of the front it launched an offensive to push the Central Powers back into the Carpathian Mountains. Since the start of the offensive, Russia had lost 390,000 men against the Central Powers' 170,000. Although Russia could replace the manpower, the ability of its forces to resist would continue to deteriorate during the campaign due to the loss of munitions and equipment. In the western part of the front, the Central Powers now concentrated their troops on the upper part of the Sun River north of Przemysl, where the river was the narrowest. It took them almost a month of fighting to cross the river and create a breachhead on the eastern bank of the Sun. This threatened to cut off the fortress of Przemysl from the rest of the Russian lines, and the Russians abandoned the fortress. The Central Powers now made a breach in the Russian defenses. They also had received some reinforcements and now had 375,000 soldiers against 345,000 Russians. They advanced from the bridgehead and captured the city of Lemberg in late June. Early July 1915. With the main railroads leading over the Carpathians in Central Powers' hands, the Central Powers now only need to gain control of the bulge in the central part of the front in order to gain a good defensive position. Here they are opposed by 780,000 Russian soldiers. Germany has strengthened its units in East Prussia, and now they have a strong force both north and south of the Russian forces with a combined 650,000 men. Russia took steps to improve its defensive position. It pulled back its armies to better positions so that it would be better able to hold on to the front. It also freed up some forces in the west and sent reinforcements from the front facing north. This enabled Russia to deploy 10 new army corps to face the Central Powers' advance from the south. This succeeded, and Russia was able to somewhat slow down the Central Powers' advance from this direction during the following weeks. But the Central Powers attacked in the north. At this moment, Germany began its offensive in the northern part of the front. Germany had 140,000 men against the Russian force of 230,000 men. In heavy fighting, the Germans were able to overcome the Russian field fortifications and then capture the fortress of Puptusk on the Russian defensive line. This meant that the Russian defensive line was broken from the north. With their forces threatened from both north and south, the Russians began falling back from the central part of the front. They first pulled back to the eastern bank of the Vistula River. Russia did not decide to defend the fortress of Ivangorod, but it left a strong garrison in their fortress of Novogeorgievsk. Then the Russian forces continued to retreat to shorten the front. The fortress of Novogeorgievsk did not perform well, and its garrison surrendered only some time after being surrounded. This news made Russia not to leave any garrisons behind the enemy lines anymore. For this reason, they did not leave any garrison in the fortress of Brest and continued to retreat. By late August, Russia had achieved a good defensive position in the center of the front. The new defenses consisted of several parts. In the north, Russia had some forces in front of a system of rivers which was strengthened by several fortresses, creating a formidable obstacle. In the south, their forces were covered by the huge Pripyat marshes, which created large obstacles for military operations. In the middle, there were no strong natural defenses, but here Russia had gathered a strong force of 20 army corps which could be capable of strong resistance. However, the front north of this position was much less defended. The Germans wanted to outflank the Russian position from the north and cut off the main Russian force by reaching the Pripyat marshes. By the end of August, the Germans had advanced in this area and had deployed a strong force for the operation. They had around 300,000 men against roughly 300,000 Russians, which gave them some advantage over the Russian forces. The Germans wanted to advance southeast towards Minsk to cut off the path of retreat from the main Russian force. By the beginning of the operation, The Germans had their forces between the fortresses of Dvinsk and Kovno. The Germans were able to quickly capture the fortress of Kovno, which opened them the way further. They then broke through the Russian defenses in the north of Vilno and sent their cavalry into the breach to cut off the Russian forces. Russia was able to redeploy some of its troops by rail, who stopped the German cavalry from reaching Minsk. At that time, a large part of the German forces on the Eastern Front was being redeployed to other fronts, and Germany did not have a chance to bring new forces to the offensive. Russia was able to hold back their advance and pull its main force out of the danger of encirclement. After that, the Germans then abandoned the offensive and went on the defensive. Both Russian and German forces took defensive positions. The campaign on the Northern Front in 1915 was over. By the end of the campaign, Russia had a combat strength of 860,000 men against roughly 475,000 German soldiers. Both sides dug in for the winter. At the same time, the Austro-Hungarian forces were conducting their own offensive in the south. Here, the Austro-Hungarian forces held the front between the Pripyat marshes and neutral Romania. The northernmost part of the front was only lightly covered by Russian forces, and Austria-Hungary wanted to launch a two-pronged attack to encircle part of the Russian forces. Austria-Hungary had a small numerical advantage with 540,000 soldiers against 500,000 Russians. The offensive began in late August. The Austro-Hungarians gained some ground, but eventually Russia strengthened the northern flank and stopped the Austro-Hungarian offensive. With this, the Central Powers offensive on the southern front had ended. By the end of the campaign, Russia had 435,000 soldiers against 440,000 Austro-Hungarians. Both sides dug in for the winter. During 1915, the Central Powers had lost on the Eastern Front 1,970,000 men dead, missing and wounded, while Russia lost 4,240,000 soldiers. These losses greatly weakened the Russian army and made it less capable of threatening the Central Powers. At the same time, the Central Powers had gained buffer territory to protect their core areas from future Russian attacks. Meanwhile, in 1916, Russia would regroup and make another offensive on the Eastern Front to break the Central Powers' defenses. This will be covered in the next video. I would like to thank my patrons for making it possible for me to have the time to research all the information that ended up in this video. Especially Eric Strachan, Kyle Askin, and Johan West. Thank you for your support.